But Guy Hamilton directed Funeral in Berlin, and he, of course, was the sort of upper crust Harry Palmer. He was the James Bond character, really, and he directed. I was Harry Palmer being directed by James Bond in Funeral in Berlin.
It must be saying something that despite there being 5 Michael Caine Harry Palmer films, it's really only the first, The Ipcress File, that is held in any kind of high regard. I'll admit, before I reviewed that film on the channel way back in 2019, I thought it was just a one-off. I didn't realise they'd made more of them, much less with directors of the profile of Goldfinger's Guy Hamilton and Women in Love's Ken Russell. But sure enough, in keeping with the 1960s spy craze, Harry Palmer was back on screens in 1966 and 1967. I mean, they were churning these things out as quickly as they were Bond films. How was Harry Saltzman doing this at the time? I can only assume his non-stop work ethic was the inspiration for the Dream Machine in Die Another Day.
You seem to work 24/7. Is it true that you don't need sleep?
You only get one shot at life. Why waste it on sleep?
Good evening, Mr. Palmer fans. I'm really glad that I had an excuse to seek out Funeral in Berlin. It also gave me an excuse to revisit The Ipcress File, which I hadn't seen since it was one of the first non-Bond movies that I reviewed on this channel way back in 2019, and I hadn't seen it since. If you'd have asked me to describe the film in any detail prior to this recent rewatch, I would have been able to tell you, well, it looks phenomenal, the John Barry score is super catchy, and Michael Caine is absolutely brilliant in it, but I'll be damned if I can remember anything about the damn story. And even after this latest revisit, that is my exact review again. It's a gorgeous looking film, and some of those shots and visuals actually really stuck with me over the years, so I was pleased to see that for the sequel, Funeral in Berlin, it retained the same cinematographer in Otto Heller, but perhaps, sadly, lost director Sidney J. Fury. Actually, judging from the behind-the-scenes accounts, Fury was lost from the first film, never mind the second. Here's a clip from the audio commentary for the film, with Fury joined by editor Peter Hunt.
You know, it's so funny, Peter, sitting here with you looking at this, because if it wasn't for you, I'd have been off this picture.
Well.
Which is an interesting story, because the producer didn't like all these funny angles and what I was doing, and you were away on vacation from the latest Bond film.
That's true.
And you came back and you ran everything on a Saturday, and Harry wanted me fired and wanted your confirmation that what I was doing was shit. And
that's true, and I wouldn't give it to him.
And I remember getting your phone call late Saturday afternoon at my place out in Roehampton, outside of London, and you congratulated me on it and said, Harry will be no problem anymore.
Well, that's perfectly true.
So I suppose that goes some way to explaining why Harry Saltzman would go on to hire Guy Hamilton to direct the second film. Hamilton was of course fresh off of Goldfinger, which sent Bond into the pop culture stratosphere, so perhaps the thought was that the director could try and do the same with Harry Palmer. Whether he was that successful though... Well, if Blu-ray availability is anything to go by, not very. I had to seek out a US release of this on eBay, because you can't even get this thing on Blu-ray in the UK. And I must say, the cover did not give me all that much faith. I mean, yes, Berlin, Cold War, Berlin Wall, fair enough, but Caine hunched over in that raincoat, like he looks like a flasher hiding in wait for nuns to walk by so he can expose himself in front of them. So the plot, Michael Caine returns as Harry Palmer, who is sent to Berlin by his boss, a returning Guy Dolman as Colonel Ross. Palmer is sent there to assist in the defection of a Soviet officer named Colonel Stock, played by Oscar Homolka. All simple enough, and indeed the first 30 minutes or so of the film are following Palmer receiving his brief, preparing for his mission, meeting an assortment of quirky and intriguing characters, ultimately leading up to his meeting with Colonel Stock, and from that point onwards there are twists and turns and intrigue and double crossings, and indeed a funeral in Berlin, but I would seriously struggle to summarize exactly what goes on in the last half of this film. I always hate admitting when I find plots difficult to follow, because inevitably I will get a bunch of comments on this video telling me how much of an idiot I am for not getting it, but honestly, this is just one of those spy films that I think you need a notepad to watch along with, or at least it's one of those films that you really need to make an effort with. Like, you really need to remember a lot of names and details, and it's not going to spoon feed you, and when it's a lot of German characters and names in particular, like, I'm not German, so some of these names just aren't very familiar to me. I mean, like, if you don't remember just one character's name in one place, an entire scene can suddenly make little to no sense, because they're all talking about someone, and you're like, wait a minute, who is that? Is that the guy who played Mr. Slugworth? Because as soon as I saw this guy, I was like, well, I'm obviously never remembering his name. He's just forever Mr. Slugworth from Willy Wonka to me. It's a very talky film too, which I guess didn't help me, nor the fact that it's just not as pretty to look at as the first. I guess if Harry Saltzman hated the Dutch angles and all that stuff that made the first one so visually appealing to me and a lot of other people, I guess it makes sense that he'd be stamping out that style for the second one. And don't get me wrong, it is still a very handsome film, but the presentation is much more conventional. The first film has some terrific shots and compositions, and in the commentary I sampled in this review earlier on, the director talks about how he was pretty much having some strong alcohol in his coffee every day to give him the gumption to actually carry out some of this stuff, because, you know, it could be seen as relatively avant-garde, particularly for the kind of film that they're setting out to make. If you are just looking for a meat and potatoes spy thriller, then you might not necessarily want all of these arty angles and compositions. Funeral in Berlin lacks that element, which means that, well, when I do get kind of lost in the story, I can't just fall back on being happy with having dynamic visuals to look at, because it all does just look a bit more conventional. However, the film does benefit from a bit more of a sense of humour this time, I'd say. It feels very in line with Guy Hamilton's influence on the Bond films too, but there were just a lot more bits of witty dialogue and humorous situations throughout the whole thing, and perhaps this is also tied in with Caine's much more confident portrayal of Harry Palmer in this outing. Very recently I made a video about The Fourth Protocol, another Michael Caine starring film, and I made the observation in that video that I didn't feel like his character in that was anything like Harry Palmer. And I received a couple of comments from people on that video saying that they felt like the character is a bit of a natural progression from Harry Palmer, and I couldn't quite see it until I saw Funeral in Berlin, which totally, for me anyway, acts as the missing link between the Ipcris file and the Fourth Protocol. Despite only being made a year or so after the Ipcris file, Alfie had been released in between these films, and I guess those early leading roles were the confidence boost he needed, because there is so much more swagger to his performance here. Perhaps that is also being influenced by the fact that the filmmakers were looking to Palmer as a potential Bond character in his own right, the two could coexist, so they were just letting that influence the character here, bringing in more humour and cockiness. I must say, while I certainly don't dislike Caine's performance here, I do prefer him in the Ipcris file, where he's just a bit more dorky and dry. Whether conscious or not, Funeral in Berlin was seemingly trying to bond up the Palmer character. I mean, some of these early exchanges with a woman in his apartment feel very Bondian in particular.
Look, he's expecting you at 1200 hours.
Tell Ross, I'll be late.
Really work on the insubordinate bit, don't you?
You're useless in the kitchen. Why don't you go back to bed?
They're still very different characters, and hey, Michael Caine never gives a bad performance. He's still a delight to watch in Funeral in Berlin, but yeah, I just didn't quite enjoy it as much as the first film. It was nice seeing Count Lippe himself, Guy Dolan, back as Colonel Ross, and I also very much enjoy seeing Oscar Homolka here. He was in an early Hitchcock film that I really love called Sabotage, so I was excited when I saw his name pop up in the credits. I also really enjoyed the score for this one too. It's certainly not as iconic or as catchy as the John Barry original, but I do think that Conrad Effers did a great job with a very different kind of music, one that really highlights the starkness between the east and west sectors of Berlin in a few places, and I guess just generally feels more German, which suits the film well, of course. Maybe I'm being too harsh on the film with the constant comparisons back to the Ipcris file, but I don't know, I just didn't gel with this one as much, largely down to the plot and how lost I got in places, but also just, the general meh attitude I had to the stakes of the whole thing. Ultimately, I didn't care how things panned out, and I was disappointed because I love what Guy Hamilton brought to the Bond series. Goldfinger and Live and Let Die are wonderful films, but when I'm in the middle of a climax and I don't really know or care about what I should be rooting for, it's just hard to be enthusiastic about it. Or maybe when I do get around to viewing this thing again, I should just make myself some helpful charts to better follow what's going on, and it'll be a 5-star experience. Let me know in the comments below what you think of Funeral in Berlin, and also Billion Dollar Brain if you have seen that film as well. In fact, why don't we ask Michael Caine what he thinks about that third Harry Palmer film?
We did Funeral in Berlin, and then we did The Billion Dollar Brain. And Funeral in Berlin was great. I enjoyed it in Berlin so much, and I liked the picture. And then we got into Finland and the snow with Ken Russell, and that didn't work out so well. Ken was more of a classical picture maker than a thriller maker. It was the wrong type of movie for Ken.
Huh? Even the star can barely say anything positive about it. Well, bodes well.